Well, thank you for that welcome, Clint, and thanks everyone for coming along today. It's great to be here in Queensland, where I grew up, talking about our latest research. And I'll just get my slides going because I always forget to do this. Politicians frame budgets to assert their superiority as economic managers, given it's the biggest macroeconomic lever under their control. The debate so often boils down to the achievement of surpluses and budget credibility. But if we're going to build consensus for budget repair, saw that went off. If we're going to build consensus for budget repair, let's not lose sight of why balanced budgets matter. Budget sustainability matters for funding Australia's social compact. And as we learnt compellingly in CEDA's community pulse work last year, the social compact matters for Australians. The Commonwealth budget reflects this. Social security and welfare, health and education make up 60% of expenditure. A balanced budget also matters for intergenerational equity. That is, ensuring that we're not financing current consumption at the expense of future generations. As we are increasingly being reminded, it also matters for having the fiscal capacity to buffer economic shocks. And it matters for building productive capacity, including targeted investment in infrastructure and skills. It is with this backdrop in mind that CEDA undertook its Sustainable Budgets report. The report takes a stocktake of how things have improved in the Commonwealth budget since our report in 2016 and looks at the steps necessary to have sustained budget balances into the future. Since CEDA's 2016 report, the Commonwealth budget balance has improved. We've seen a 0.4% improvement in the underlying balance in 2018-19 and a surplus is in sight in 19-20, which will be necessary to pay down the $340 billion of net debt that Australia has. So if we have a look at just how this has come about, on the left-hand side you can see what I call a running score of how the economy and other variables have impacted on the budget bottom line. That's the yellow line. And then you can also see the blue line, which is policy decisions and how they've impacted. Now that yellow line shows that up until 2017-18, the economy and other factors were a major drag on the budget balance. And up until this point, you'd have to say the government showed a fair amount of fiscal restraint, with policy decisions having a neutral to positive impact. Since the economy picked up, the fiscal straitjacket has been loosened. As well as new spending, we've seen tax cuts so that the government remains under its 23.9% tax to GDP cap. On the right-hand side, you can see just how disciplined spending growth has been, reaching the lowest level in decades. I think it's worth noting here that governments don't get a whole lot of credit for keeping spending growth low, and we should probably give them more. In WA, where major budget repair is the order of the day, the government has been spruiking about spending restraint as being boring is the new black. You might not be surprised to hear that this doesn't seem to be taking off as a rallying cry for budget repair. Despite all the progress made, there's still significant risks in both the short and the long term. On the expenditure side, continuing discipline will need to be maintained to see a sustained return to surpluses. Spending growth averages just 1.1% in the 3 years from 2019-20. If that was to slip to 1.5%, it would be enough to wipe $16.5 billion from the balance across the forward estimates and put the 19-20 surplus at risk. There's also a real risk of faster payments growth in an election year. At present, the budget factors in a 0.6% increase in expenditure in the fiscal year after the election 19-20. In the fiscal year after the last 17 elections, only 3 have resulted in payments growth at this rate or slower. We've also seen in the last week a heightened awareness of the risks to the budget from the economy. But so far, nominal GDP growth, which drives tax revenues, has held up well. When we look further out, the long-term budget pressures continue to mount. Assuming all other policy settings remain constant, if health spending across the Federation grows at the rate it has in the last decade, then we'll be facing a funding gap of 6% of GDP in 2054-55. And at a time when Australians are being told that they will need to spend more time in education and training to keep up with technology, spending on vocational education and training has not increased in real terms in the last decade. There's also a compelling case to address the inadequate rate of New Start by $75 a week, which would cost $3.3 billion a year to the budget. There are also growing calls to progressively increase foreign aid, a perennial favourite for budget savings over the last decade. Reaching the previous target we set ourselves would cost about $5 billion a year. I've spoken about health, but we cannot ignore the fiscal pressures facing our states, who receive $120 billion in payments from the Commonwealth each year and have a range of long-term challenges of their own. For example, New South Wales will face a fiscal gap of 3.4% of GDP by 2056. So with these short and long-term pressures in mind, the gathering economic uncertainty and a federal election looming, policymakers that you can see on the screen are rightly preaching the need for fiscal discipline. The question, of course, is how to instil new disciplines. The foundations of the Commonwealth's Charter of Budget Honesty have served us well, but we need to build on them. Almost 20 years since the first intergenerational report, it's time to adjust the framework and enhance the IGR. The IGR should provide a whole of federation assessment, including all the states and territories, drawing on the framework established by the Productivity Commission's Ageing Report, and working closely with heads of Treasury across the country. It should also have a serious go at assessing intergenerational equity in the budget and where the risks are. It should make use of scenario analysis to test the robustness of current fiscal policy settings to the biggest uncertainty in any budget, the economy. And it should also interrogate emerging funding pressures more. Take mental health, a small but important and rapidly increasing part of the budget, not mentioned once in the 2015 IGR. There are now 2.4 million Medicare subsidised mental health services and over 4 million people receiving mental health related prescriptions each year. Finally, an intergenerational report by its very nature is likely to reflect poorly on the current policies of the day. After all, what is fine today may be unsustainable in future decades. And this is exactly what it should do, laying bare the future trade-offs. The report would benefit, therefore, from being produced at greater arm's length from the government of the day. Based on capability and international precedent, CEDA supports the Parliamentary Budget Office preparing future IGRs. We also need to reignite a culture of evaluation in the Commonwealth Public Service if Australia is to deliver better outcomes in service delivery. Recent evidence from the Productivity Commission regarding the paucity of data and evaluation in Indigenous programs typifies this challenge. But it hasn't always been like this. Between 1993 and 1997, the Commonwealth Government published 530 evaluation reports. At this point, all budget-funded programs were required by statute to be evaluated every 3 to 5 years. This discipline has since been abandoned. It's time to go back to the future and reinstate evaluation of all budget-funded programs every 5 years. And finally, an iron law of budgets is that it's unsustainable for spending to grow faster than GDP growth for extended periods. In Australia's case, we can see from this chart that when payments grow slower than GDP, we are either in surplus or improving the budget balance. Spending rules are therefore vital. They are transparent, incontrovertible, credible, and understandable. History also shows that spending rules have worked in keeping spending growth below economic growth. Governments should adopt and maintain explicit rules to this end. But even if governments do maintain expenditure discipline, it doesn't mean that it's sustainable, and it doesn't mean that we're getting the best value for money from services. This is going to require governments to break free of the shackles on innovation, ceasing activities that don't add value, and delivering more place-based approaches. But where do we start? Well, our federation has to be part of the solution. But Commonwealth overreach, prescriptive funding agreements and micromanagement are unlikely to be the answer. 11 years ago, and you can see the smiles on the faces there, Australian governments heralded a path-breaking new Commonwealth state funding agreement. That is a major consolidation of 92 specific purpose payments into 5 or 6 national agreements. COAG spruiked to focus on outcomes and flexibility for jurisdictions. There now seems to be broad consensus that this has unravelled. There's been a proliferation of funding agreements, continuing prescriptions on service delivery, and administrative burden across governments. There are still 5 national agreements, but there's 76 national partnership, project and other agreements. They see the Commonwealth Government oversight and reporting lines in weird and wonderful places. For example, the $6.3 million upgrade to the Ballina Hospital, or the $10 million South Sydney Rabbitohs Community and High Performance Centre of Excellence. I just hope that they're looking north of the border if they were looking for rugby league excellence. A federal election further heightens the risk of continuing proliferation of these sorts of agreements. It's time to recommit to the original ambitions of the Intergovernmental Agreement, consolidate agreements, and reassess the need for any new ones. Such a move might just create goodwill and grease the wheels of reform so that we can tackle a serious program of reform in health. It's clear from CEDA's Community Pulse survey last year that Australians place priority above all else on quality and affordable healthcare. The recommendations contained in the Productivity Commission's 5-year productivity review, which it estimates would save $140 billion over 20 years, would be a good place to start. It's time for COAG to put serious reform of health back on the table. Of course, the only thing more challenging than health reform is tax reform. We've had plenty of false starts on this over the last decade, and you'd have to say it's catching up with us, both from a fiscal and an economic perspective. Personal income taxpayers have been bearing a significant burden from budget repair. Even with the recent personal income tax cuts, every quintile will see increasing average tax rates over the next decade. And to underline the point that bracket creep impacts everyone, consider the fact that a full-time minimum wage earner is now starting to face a marginal tax rate of 32.5%. Our other revenue crutch has been company tax, which has a lot to do with the recent budget improvement. But the evidence suggests that it comes at a cost to our economy. The latest OECD evidence suggests that Australia's effective average tax rates are uncompetitive. And I stress the word effective here. They take into account a range of incentives in the tax system aside from the statutory rate, including accelerated depreciation. For new investments, we had the 9th highest rate of 70 countries, and for expansion of existing investments, Australia had the 3rd highest of 77 countries. Our corporate tax base is also relatively volatile and can swing down just as quickly as it can swing up, making budget forecasters' lives precarious. We cannot forget that just 6 companies account for a quarter of our corporate tax base, the 4 banks and the 2 large miners. Therefore, we do support efforts over time to try and limit the negative economic impacts of these tax bases. That means addressing bracket creep with a focus on personal income tax relief for those facing the most rapidly increasing average tax rates in the 2nd and 3rd income quintiles. On the corporate tax side, in absence of consensus to reduce the statutory rate, there's a need for stopgap measures like allowances for new investment. We also looked around at the various tax proposals that have been part of recent economic debates, previous tax reviews and previous CEDA reports. Our intention here was to identify sensible proposals that could be used to address a revenue shortfall or fund tax relief to rebalance the tax system. In the report, we seek to outline a balanced and succinct account of different proposals, the case for change, relevant historical context, and the risks. Some of the proposals we have identified are contentious, and I don't for a second suggest that any of these relatively modest proposals are easy. Tax changes never are, not even tax cuts. We have stressed that there's time to progressively implement careful changes with well-crafted transitions to limit any unintended consequences or undue hardship. The removal of dividend imputation refundability is perhaps the most contentious at the present time. Refundability was introduced in 2001, a relative boom time for the budget. And the revenue foregone from this move was exacerbated by the decision to make super earnings for those over 60 tax-free from 2006. We fully accept in the report that refundability is consistent with an imputation system. That is, where company tax forms a prepayment of shareholders' tax, with the final tax obligation being paid at their marginal tax rate, even if that rate is 0 and results in a refund cheque from the ATO. But the revenue sustainability equation for such a pure form of imputation is challenging, especially at a time when a growing number of older Australians have 0 taxable incomes. The revenue foregone has grown from around $550 million at the time of introduction to around $5 billion today. The equation is still growing. With an ageing population, we'll have 7 million people aged 65 and over by 2050. Both the Financial System Inquiry and the Rethink Tax White Paper processes highlighted the increasing revenue cost. We're sensitive to the fact that people have planned their retirements with this policy in place. They may have uncertainty about their longevity, and some people with more modest incomes could be impacted. This will require careful design and transition. Reducing the capital gains tax discount was identified as a priority in the Henry Review and also CEDA's 2017 Housing Australia report. It will reduce the distortionary impact of different tax rates across shares and housing vis-a-vis other savings vehicles. It also responds to a lower inflationary environment. We've also identified work-related expenses as a target area. The Tax Commissioner has highlighted this as the most significant area of tax leakage, with an estimated $2.5 billion of overclaiming each year. The government could seek to clamp down on this. A more radical proposal would be to eliminate expenses entirely or have a default claim and use savings for personal income tax cuts. This is what New Zealand did some time back. And finally, Australia's rather complex and inconsistent approach to taxing alcohol would benefit from a move towards full volumetric taxation. This is another area that's been under consideration for some time, having featured in the Henry Review and proposals from state health bodies. So to conclude, budgets are all about trade-offs, and I've outlined many of them today. The good news is that we still have time and we do have choices. And if we make conscious decisions now to strengthen the budget, grow the economy, and protect our social compact, we can avoid abrupt and painful adjustments in the future. It's perhaps naive in the current political climate, but there's every chance if we look squarely to the long-term challenges and seek to address those, the short term may take care of itself. Thanks for your time.